Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video lesson about Reconstruction. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Now, this is part one of 2 video lessons. So, in today's video lesson, we're going to talk about the central questions, or I'm going to introduce the central questions of Reconstruction, and we're going to explore these in greater detail in class. We're going to look at the comparison of Reconstruction plans between Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. We're going to look at Andrew Johnson's background, because that's really, really important in order to understand his particular plan for Reconstruction. We're also going to take a look at the black codes. Now, this is going to be like an overview or kind of a survey of what those are. We're going to take a much more in-depth look at the actual primary sources in class. So here we go. Right, so central questions. At the end of the Civil War, United States society was completely like, all right, it had to be completely reorganized to account for the changes in American society that the Civil War caused. So the first question we really need to talk about is, what system of labor should replace slavery? I mean, the reality of this situation was that in the South, the foundational structure that existed in Southern society, and this was about political stuff, this was about economic stuff certainly, but it was also about social structure as well. Slavery formed the foundation of all those systems. So with slavery gone, what do you use to replace it? This is a big, big question, and one that sadly the United States did not do a good job of answering. What rights should freedmen receive other than emancipation? Now, we like to romanticize and kind of look through rose-colored glasses some of our history and some of our more important historical figures. Abraham Lincoln is a prime guy for this. People call him the great emancipator, as if he truly believed that blacks and whites were equal in every way. This was historically not true. Just because Northerners and Federalists wanted to get rid of slavery did not mean that they desired the equality of blacks and whites. So this question became more of an issue because now we need to figure out, okay, how far does this equality go? Okay, and should complete equality exist? This was a tough question for a lot of people at the time. And then you've got to somehow bring the Confederate States back into the Union, right? So on what terms should they be reunited with the Union? What are the requirements? What should they have to give something up? Should they have to do certain things? And what things should they give up? And what things do they need to do? Very important question. And how far should the federal government go to settle these concerns? How much power and authority should the federal government have in either encouraging or, in some cases, outright forcing the South to capitulate, to agree to these issues? So these are absolutely loaded questions that did not have easy answers. And as you're going to see, not just through this unit, but through the rest of American history, for a lot of these questions, we didn't really find good answers. And it's one of the primary reasons, the failure of Reconstruction is one of the primary reasons why we're still dealing with a lot of racial issues today. All right, so comparison of the presidential plans. We're going to start with Lincoln since he was president first. But it should be noted, his plan was never enacted because he was assassinated before it could be. But we're going to take a look at what he proposed. All right, so he wanted a middle ground. He wanted to compromise. He did not see any benefit in dragging out the reunification any longer than it had to be. He really wanted a relatively fast way to get the states back in, the southern states back in. He firmly believed that the South should not be punished. With punishment comes revenge seeking, and with revenge seeking comes bitterness, and with bitterness, you can't reunify. You can't have a true unified country with bitterness and with revenge seeking. So he really believed the South should not be punished. He issued a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, but proclamations don't really have that the true force of law. It's not an act of Congress. He did enact this thing called the 10% plan, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Well, he suggested the 10% plan. He believed that the states could return to the Union without a problem. Why? I mean, didn't they violate the Constitution? He said, no, 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 no. Individuals violated the Constitution. The individual Confederate leaders did that. And the individual people in the state Congress, the state legislatures did that, but not the states themselves. So, and that's kind of semantics right there. But in his view, no problem to have the states return to the Union because it was individuals that violated it. He also vetoed this thing called the Wade-Davis bill, which we'll talk about more in class. Now, Johnson. Johnson's a completely separate animal, and because he was Lincoln's vice president and became president once Lincoln was assassinated, this was the plan that got enacted. So, he appointed provisional governors. Basically, he helped to establish dictatorships, largely, in the southern states after the end of the war. He argued that the states had to hold new constitutional conventions and adopt the things that he wanted. He said only loyal whites could vote, which define loyal. I mean, how does one determine that? So that's a slippery slope. Basically, he gave himself uniform authority to decide who was loyal and who wasn't. A very dangerous position to be in for the chief executive. It affords that position far too much power. He required an oath of allegiance to the Union. Confederate leaders were completely excluded from this reunification and from being allowed to rejoin the Union and from amnesty. You had to directly apply for a presidential pardon to regain any political and property rights. Southern states had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which officially banned slavery. They had to repudiate the national debt. Ask me about that in class. We'll talk a bit more about that in class. And all states had to declare their ordinances of secession illegal. Now, the thing that I really just want to spend a second talking about is this applying for a presidential pardon to regain political and property rights. Basically, you have to bow down to Johnson and do whatever he wants. And if you don't do what he wants precisely in the way that he wants it, you're not getting anything. You're done. He has complete and full control over who's allowed to get their political and property rights back and who isn't. So this is a very dangerous situation to have existing. So these are the same things that we just saw in the previous slides. I just wanted to kind of put them as comparative, a side-by-side comparison there so you can take a look just to see the juxtaposition and the contrast between each presidential plan. So if you've already written this down from the previous slides, you do not have to write all of this down because, well, you've already written it down. So. Okay, now Lincoln's 10% plan was interesting. So in his articulation, 10% of the population takes the oath. Once they do that, states can come right back into the Union. He proposed this during the war, and he did this because he wanted to give those who were weary from the fighting and were just done with the war, they just wanted it over, he wanted to give them some light at the end of the tunnel. He wanted to give them a way out, something that they really wanted to grab onto. It was, as I said, never enacted. The Republicans, which would become the radical Republicans a little bit later on, they said it didn't go far enough because his 10% plan did not guarantee black male suffrage, so they refused to enact it at all. You're going to see this kind of obstinance from the radical Republicans, and although their interests were good, they were true, they really were trying to achieve some equality, some significant equality for African Americans, but some of the other actions they took towards the South were very counterproductive, as we'll see. All right, Johnson's background. He was a white Southerner, but despite the fact he was a white Southerner, he was loyal to the Union. He did not agree with secession. He did not side with the Southern states, despite the fact that he was from the South. He was against the planter class, okay? So he hated wealthy Southerners because his big issue with slavery was not that it was wrong. The problem with slavery was that the planter class was hogging it and that all white people didn't have slaves. He wanted all white people to have it. So that was his issue. He was avowedly racist. I mean, by any definition, this man was as racist as they come. And like I say right there, he was pro-slavery for everyone. He endorsed emancipation not because he wanted to free the slaves, not because he believed in African-American equality, only to reduce the power of the wealthy planter class. And if you can believe this, he had a worse relationship with Congress than Lincoln did. Now, I understand that in the current political climate, the current political environment, it's hard to imagine anyone having a worse relationship with Congress than our last couple of chief executives, but let me assure you that Johnson's was way worse. It's probably the worst this country's ever seen. I mean, that's kind of an absolute statement. I'm sure somebody can argue against that, but it was pretty bad. So we're going to take a closer look at that. All right, so we have sectionalist divides again because we just can't seem to get rid of sectionalism. We just can't seem to lose it, right? It just keeps popping up and causing all kinds of problems. So initially, the Republicans and Northerners were happy with Johnson because he was going after those wealthy plantation owners who they hated. So it was kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of thing. But this changed massively when Johnson did all of these things right here. So the ones that bowed down to him, he pardoned those Confederate officials. Then he allowed the passage of the Black Codes, which was basically another version of slavery, if not in actual name, certainly in the same spirit as slavery. He denied blacks the right to vote straight up, and he vetoed 2 bills that were designed to extend the Freedmen's Bureau and to nullify the Black Codes. The Freedmen's Bureau was this organization, this federal bureaucracy that was designed to help newly freed slaves acclimate to free life. So they would provide education, training, resources, some land, and they would help these newly freed slaves get up on their feet and actually build a life. So, of course, since Johnson did not like black people, he was not about the Freedmen's Bureau, so he vetoed that completely. So what was the response to Johnson? Well, that response was out-and-out rebellion. So when the Southern Congressional Delegation, all the Congress people, or congressmen, because there were no congresswomen at this point, when all the congressmen from the South showed up to, like, serve, you know, in Congress, they just locked the doors. The radical Republicans just wouldn't even let them in. They refused to seat them at all. Then they established a joint committee to reevaluate the Reconstruction policy, and they set additional conditions for readmission to the Union. That's like changing the rules in the middle of the game. Like, that's messed up, man. They had a 2/3 majority, and they passed a civil rights bill overriding Johnson's veto. They did pass the 14th Amendment. That was a good thing. But they also enacted very radical Reconstruction policies, which even sympathetic Northerners disagreed with. So there were some issues. Like, they doubled down on Johnson. All right, so what are the Black Codes? Well, here's the thing. The Black Codes were set up on purpose to ensure failure by freed slaves. They wanted to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the argument of Southerners was like, black people are not equal to white people, and they will never be able to get on their feet. They will never be able to become productive citizens of society. So by instituting the Black Codes, they tried to ensure that future. So first off, it's illegal for blacks to be unemployed, right? So you can't be unemployed. If you're unemployed, you are in jail. Now, before I continue, I want to make this known that none of these things applied to white people. None of them. This was all completely against black people only. Okay, so it was illegal for blacks to be unemployed, but in order to be employed, you had to apprentice. Apprentice is kind of like training and practice with a master of the craft. But you had to find a master blacksmith, for example, who was willing to give you an apprenticeship, which all these master blacksmiths were all white, or any other profession, pick it, they're all white. So they refused to hire black apprentices. So because black people couldn't get apprenticeships, then they couldn't get jobs, therefore they were unemployed, therefore now they're going to jail. It was a complete circular thing designed to make black people fail. Like, this was the purpose of the Black Codes. It was completely racist, completely awful. Then there were poll taxes. So yeah, you got the right to vote, but when you show up to the polls, you have to pay this ridiculous tax, okay? Now, if by some miracle you got the money to get to pay the tax, well, they found a way around that too, because after poll taxes, and they added literacy tests, which no white person could ever pass. But they made it so hard on purpose so that black people couldn't vote. So they were actively denying black people the right to vote that way. And all of this resulted in extended servitude that was very similar to slavery. All right, you had community and private enterprise banding together to achieve segregation in every facet of Southern society. It was pervasive. There was almost no way around it. Then further, if you managed to get the money together, if you managed to find somebody who was willing to sell you property, there were limits on what property you could own, legal limits, and how much property you could own, right? So even then, when you go through all these other hurdles, every time black people got through one hurdle, there were like 12 more that white racist people created just to make it that much harder for them to do it. And we're going to talk about the bad and the ugly of all of these Black Codes. This doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. This is like cartoon hour compared to what a lot of the Black Codes were in these southern states. And it's important that we understand what was done, how it was done, and why it was done, so that we can learn from that and improve and not have this happen again. So that is the end of part 1. I will see you in part 2.